Hello there. You're listening to 10 Questions, where we discuss the wetplate collodion process and the photographers that create these unique images known as ambrotypes and tintypes. I'm your host, Chad Shryock, wetplate photographer for Pork Pie Photography based in Fort Collins, Colorado. In each episode, I've asked a modern-day practitioner to sit down with me and talk about how they got involved with this vintage process, share some information on their gear and studio, and provide some valuable insights into their creative process. So whether you're just beginning to dabble your toes in the collodion ethers, or you're a seasoned silverbath expert, hang on and see what develops with 10 Questions. In this episode, we're expanding our international guest list to another write-in suggestion from the 10 Questions audience. My next guest has been collecting cameras and other photographica for decades. He first began investigating alternative photographic processes in the mid-'70s and has been shooting ever since. It's already tomorrow where my next guest resides, so we're doing our first time travel episode as well. Based in Carterton, New Zealand, I'd like to welcome Brian Scadden to 10 Questions. Hey, Brian, how are you?
I'm pretty good, thanks, Chad. Yeah, and yourself?
Doing well, thank you. Thanks for being on the podcast today. It's always good to talk to folks that have been involved in the process for as long as you have.
Yeah.
So maybe before we talk about collodion, let's talk about your start. You kind of got started working in the film photography business in the mid-'70s. What kind of work were you doing for the National Film Unit?
I was working in the laboratory part of it, and that was doing colour timing or colour grading. And in fact, I colour timed or graded Peter Jackson's first 4 movies. That was just one of my first jobs when I started there. So that was basically just going through and balancing shot to shot, colour-wise, density-wise. So,
Okay.
And from there, I moved on to the optical effects department. So that was making the roller credits and all that sort of thing, speeding things up, slowing them down, zooming in, all this sort of stuff, which was done all on film long before digital came along. So a lot more labour intensive. And then when the film unit got sold up at early 2000s, Peter Jackson bought the whole unit, and I became laboratory manager there and retired about 5 years ago. And from then on, I've been working on our 7-acre little farmlet here, but also doing work for Archive New Zealand. We set a lab up there so we could develop film, preserve film back onto a polyester base film, so that instead of digitizing, we were putting it all back on polyester film so that it will last a lot longer than who knows how long the digital files will last. So
Right.
That's when I gave up that last year. And so since then, I've been just here at home doing my wetplate stuff.
That's quite the start to your career to get to work with Peter Jackson in those early days.
Yeah, for sure.
He's probably a bit of a celebrity for sure in that area, right?
He is, because we worked on Lord of the Rings and King Kong, The Hobbit. When I left, we'd just finished doing The Hobbit, so that was all done digitally. The other ones were done with a mixture, but mainly with film. So, and my wife and I still shoot a hell of a lot of film, 120 and 35mm, as well as doing our wetplate stuff.
Very nice. So it sounds like you are a collector of sorts when it comes to vintage wetplate and collodion images. What really started your interest in collecting and viewing these archival or these really old images?
Well, I think one day I'd been into an antique shop and I picked up an ambrotype, and I was just fascinated with it, and did some research and realised that these things were, they were unique. They were a one-off. So, and it was just the way they presented as well, in their little cases with the gold border on them, usually a leather case, and it was what got me about cased images like daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, tintypes is that because they are a one-off, that person who is the subject of the photograph would have actually handled that. There's no way they wouldn't have. You can imagine that they've paid a lot of money to get their portrait made. The photographer would have gone into his darkroom, processed the image, brought it out in its little case and handed it to the person. So there's that sort of direct contact that I found fascinated me.
Nice. Well, here in America, I mean, tintypes are in almost every antique store. How easy is it to find those types of images in New Zealand?
Quite difficult, actually. The number of times I've been to the States, yes, I was quite amazed by the amount of material around, and also on, say, on eBay and some of the other sites. It's just amazing how many daguerreotypes and ambrotypes are out there compared to what we can see. In New Zealand here, it was a case of going into antique shops. Every time we'd go away on a trip, I'd be going into antique shops looking for them and not finding many at all. So quite a few are sort of coming to light now in our sort of online auctions and so forth. But no, we have very, very few over here compared to what you guys in the States or what is available in Britain as well.
Yeah. I know one of the first things that I like to do whenever I find an old cased image is to try and crack it open and take a look inside to see if there's any identification, any other information. Have you found anything unusual or interesting in your collection?
Not really. Some, as you say, most of them are, not identified. Sometimes you'll get, as you say, a little piece of paper in the back which will say who it is, but sometimes it'll just say Aunt Martha, and that doesn't really tell you a lot. I do have a couple which have locks of hair attached to the case, so which is interesting because those locks of hair obviously belong to the person in the image. But yeah, I've got quite a few that are identified, but there's no New Zealand ones. I've got, I think, one or two New Zealand ambrotypes, but no New Zealand daguerreotypes. They are like hen's teeth. I think all in all, with all the museums and whatever in the country and archives, there's probably only 8 or 10 New Zealand examples of daguerreotypes that were shot here, so they are very, very rare.
Yeah, that's pretty incredible just to be able to find those few, it sounds like.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So, Brian, when did you decide to start learning about the collodion process? Or I guess maybe any of the other alternative processes. I know you're not completely focused on collodion work, but what kind of drove you to look into that?
Well, as I say, before, when I started collecting ambrotypes and daguerreotypes, I realised that, and also with my camera collection, I managed to get a large or half plate Thornton Pickard camera, field camera, and so with our large laboratory that we had at the film unit, we had a lot of the chemistry that was needed, and we had a lot of downtime. So we had heaps of time to sort of play around up in the in one of the dark rooms there, and to try and learn the process. When I got the larger camera, I realised that hey, I can shoot some of these ambrotypes. Try this out. The trouble was trying to find all the chemistry. So I had the camera, I had the glass plates, and I went along to the local pharmacy. Yes, you can have, we've got collodion, but it was flexible collodion, so it's got oil of cloves and so forth in it, and not really suitable. I managed to get a few images on it, but it certainly wasn't the way to go. And then a chap from Australia, Sandy Barry, came over to one of our camera collecting symposiums and put me on the right track as far as what he'd been using. And he said you've got to have non-flexible collodion, pure alcohol, and went through a whole list. So I had most of that stuff. I hunted round and found a bottle of German collodion at one of the universities, and so as soon as I started using pure collodion, everything changed. From then on, I was actually getting images which looked like images. So really it was a difficulty in finding the chemistry. But in fact, going round to some of the university chemistry departments, I managed to get everything I really needed. So that got me started. And that was probably about 1983, 84 that I really got into the wet plate side of things. When I ran out of that collodion, then I realised I couldn't get any more. No one in New Zealand had it. So I managed to find an ink making company, and they had nitrocellulose. So it was like a powder, a white powder. And so they were quite willing to sell it to me. So now, since then, I bought like 3 kilos of the stuff. And so now I make my own collodion. We can't buy collodion in New Zealand, so I make all my own collodion from pure nitrocellulose.
So this was kind of early 80s time frame then. Were you aware of any other collodion photographers in New Zealand at that time?
There were none. No,
there were none.
Not at all. As I say, Sandy Barry, I knew a chap from Australia. He had since given up the process. There was no one in New Zealand, and when I got hold of Mark and France Osterman, they said at the time that they only knew of something like 8 practitioners in the whole world doing it. So that was quite interesting. And then I also contacted Will Dunaway, who was a great friend of mine, and he passed away recently, and he gave me quite a lot of tips on and helped me with the process as well. But no, for years and years and years, I was the only one in New Zealand doing the process. So then I started teaching, and from then on, I suppose I would have taught 50 or 60 people the process over the years, but not many of them have actually carried on with it. So I suppose the difficulty and that sort of thing, and people have got other things to spend their money on. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, it sounds like just trying to get a hold of the chemistry is probably the biggest hurdle to a lot of folks there. So
it is, but there is one thing that we can buy pure 96% alcohol or ethanol. We just need a permit for that, which the government gives to us for nothing, which is amazing. So we got the permit, and then I can just go and buy a 20-litre drum of pure food grade alcohol for very, very little money. Whereas when I was in the States, I was told there was only 4 states in America where you could actually buy this stuff called Everclear, and you could buy those from liquor outlets, and
right.
It's like pure drinkable, 96% alcohol.
Yeah, it's not very drinkable, but it is available.
No, not at all.
So I guess with you being the only person in New Zealand that was doing this, I guess this kind of explains the moniker that you've picked up as the Godfather of collodion, right? Yeah. And I've just turned 70, so I feel more like a godfather, So let's talk about your early learning experience. So once you discovered wetplate, you were able to track down chemistry and cameras and all those things. How did you really go about learning the process? I mean, what were some of the resources out there that kind of helped you along?
Very, very few resources. I did have the Keepers of Light, which is a more or less a Bible for alternative processes and whatever. So I sort of had that as a basis, but there was no other information available at all. Nowadays, people get on Facebook and whatever, and all the groups of people, doing the process now, thousands of people worldwide, or hundreds and hundreds at least, are doing the process. So you go onto one of these sites, as and if you've got an issue or a problem that you want solved, you can put that up on the site, and you'll probably end up with half a dozen totally different explanations as to why your collodion's not working or why your silver bath's not working.
Right.
And you've just got to pick through that.
Yeah.
So, there was no information as such. So it was all hands-on and a case of just trial and error, basically.
Yeah. So it sounds like this early collodion that you had a bit of a maybe a plasticizer in it with some different oils and such. Tell me about that very first plate. Do you remember what it was and kind of how that experience was?
Yeah, I think my very first plate would have been one of our golden retrievers sitting still or asleep on the lawn, um, and I thought, oh well, I'll take a photo of him. Well, I used my half plate or 5.7 almost camera, and I would have got maybe a square inch of image in the middle of the plate. And I still remember running into my first wife and saying, look, look, look at this. And she's looking at it and saying, what? And I'm saying, look, I've got an image. So that was very, very exciting. But from then on, as I say, once I got the correct chemistry, then just like someone turned the light on. Or up till then, with this flexible collodion, it was just a real problem. But as soon as I started using, the correct chemistry, it all just seemed to come together very, very quickly.
Right, right. I mean that's got to be a pretty tremendous experience to go through that process, and I'm assuming you probably never seen it firsthand at that point, right?
No, no,
Yeah,
not at all.
and to go through this process and you actually get an image that you can maybe somewhat tell what it was. That's pretty thrilling, right? That probably hooked you from the start.
Oh, it did, and half a golden retriever's head on the middle of a plate. Yeah, it wasn't much, but it was enough to really get me going. Up until then, it would have been a case of like I'd drag out the equipment and have a bit of a play round on a Saturday afternoon, and and then not end up with much at all, if it even, no image at all. And so you'd put it all away and then maybe drag it out again in another few weeks and have another crack at it. But as soon as I got that first image and the correct chemistry, then yeah, it was away. And it was a sense of achievement. That's what I find about the process is that, you're starting from a handful of chemicals and you're actually making an image which is going to probably outlast digital images. We know, that, and even film, print are not going to last forever. All our old transparencies from the 70s and 80s starting to go magenta, digital. As I say, I've worked in the film industry and that's all gone digital, but I still don't trust it. We just don't know how long the digital images will last, the corrupt files and that sort of thing. With wetplate and with daguerreotypes, we know, because we've got examples and collections and so forth, that these things have been around. I've got some in the, my collection. They're 150, 160 years old, and honestly, they're as good as the day they were made. So that's one thing that when you looked at the image, you thought, I've made this from bottles of collodion and whatever, and I've actually made an image which I know is going to be there for, maybe a couple of 100 years.
Yeah. And,
And
the biggest issue with technology is inherently it changes, right? And I've got, not just CDs and things like that, but old floppy disks and zip drives and things like that have, archival information on them that it's getting to be where it's very difficult to even find the equipment to be able to access that stuff anymore. So,
Yeah, absolutely, and that's one of my big arguments for, like when I was working at archives, we were putting everything back onto polyester stock, like all our old Second World War archive footage and all this sort of stuff. We put it onto polyester base Kodak stock, and they reckon that that'll be around in 200 or 300 years if it's stored correctly, but we don't know with digital. And yeah, I'm the same. I've got CDs and all sorts. I've got external hard drives all sitting in a safe. But you've got to keep migrating it, and that's what people don't realise, that with a collodion image, you don't have to migrate it, whereas with digital, you do. Otherwise you're going to lose it.
right.
But and, you've got other people who will just say, no, 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 it'll be around. But yeah, I don't know. I just don't trust it that much.
Right, right. Yeah, it's along for as long as the cloud is around now.
Yeah, exactly. And as you say, with all these different formats and stuff, yeah, that who's going to have a computer? I mean, I've my old computer, which I've thrown out, you could take 3-inch floppies on it, but when we were working at archives, we still had stuff there. You could put a 5-inch floppy in it, which was
Right.
quite amazing. Yeah.
Yep. So how long after that first image that you did on wetplate was it until you actually saw somebody else with your own eyes go through this process?
Oh, about 20 years maybe. Yeah, it was a long, long time because no one else was doing it. And so, in fact, Paul Alsop was one of my students. He was probably one of the first that came to me and said, he wanted a portrait done of him and his family. I did that, and then he said, "Oh, I'd like to learn the process." Well, he was one of the first that I actually taught or passed on the knowledge to. So I never saw anyone up until that time actually make another image, and it was just because as I was teaching him, yeah, he was shooting these images. But then I came to the States a couple of times, and Will Dunaway, I stayed with him, and he was probably the first practitioner, someone who had been doing it for quite a long time, that I actually saw, doing the process.
Yeah, you had mentioned that sense of accomplishment as you go through this process that you're actually able to create something, but to go for 20 years and not see anyone else to do it. I mean, it must have seemed like you were the one that discovered this process in a way.
Well, and my wife at the time, she said, "Well, you're the only one that you're doing the process. Why would you teach someone else so that they can come in and because at that stage I was doing events at some of the Victorian reenactments and that sort of thing. So I'd sort of cornered the market, and I still remember her saying, "Oh, this guy wants to learn, but as soon as you teach him and other people, then you've lost your edge there." And I said, "Well, yeah, that's not what it was all about. I'd much rather pass the knowledge on than just sort of keep it to my chest because I knew that eventually people were going to learn. But yeah, you can't be sort of dog in a manger type thing and say, nah, that's it. I'm not teaching anyone because this is my precious.
Right, right. How prevalent is wet plate in New Zealand these days?
Not so much. It's my wife and I still teach the process, and we still get, I suppose, maybe four or five people who come to our place here, to our home, to learn per year. We also teach down in Wellington. There's an art school down there, so we do like just an introductory 1 day course down there as well. So but very, very few people actually go on to keep, practicing the process after they've left here.
Yeah.
They'll go away saying, "Oh, this is great, this is great." They'll have a handful of images they've made, and a lot of the time you never hear back from them. I'm the only one in the country who's supplying, or nearly all of the wet platers who are still practicing in the country, which is not many. I'm the one that supplies them with collodion and silver and bits and pieces like that. So
Yeah.
just because it's so difficult to find it here, so I just yeah, if they've done a workshop with us, then yes, certainly I encourage them to carry on.
Yeah, I think that's pretty common. It seems to be kind of a very low retention rate for people that kind of stay with the process. It's a big investment just to get started, but then to keep up that motivation to keep shooting, that seems to be an
Yeah,
issue for some folks.
yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And just yeah, as you say, and the cost of I mean, silver nitrate is very expensive. And when people, you say how much you're going to need for one silver bath, they sort of, you see their eyes think like, bloody hell, that much. And you say, well, if you look after your silver bath, then it's not like you tip it out at the end of the day and start with a new one.
Yeah.
If you treat it right, it'll last for years. As you know, and that's one thing that gets me is looking at some of the sites online and people are, they say, oh, I've done this with the silver, I've piled a whole lot of this into it and that into it, I've put acid in it, I've put alkaline in it, I've sunned it, I've boiled it and whatever. And I look at it and think, you don't need to do all that. With mine, I sun it sometimes, bring it back up to, use a hydrometer, bring it back up to strength. But that's about all I do. At the end of each session, I filter it through cotton wool balls in a funnel, but I don't dick with it too much. Some people just, they overcomplicate the process. I found that with a lot of reading a lot of comments online, people just tend to overdo it. I say to people, look, it's an exact science in certain ways, but if when you're mixing up your developer, you could put 15 grams of ferrous sulfate in your developer, you could put 20 in your developer, you might get a slightly different look, but it's not like you have to have it bang on. Some people just sort of say, oh, it's got to be, when you put your plate in your silver bath, it's got to be there for 4 minutes. Well, if the weather is warm, if your silver bath is warm, it'll be less than that. If it's cold, it'll be more than that. It doesn't have to be absolutely bang on. You can try all sorts of developers and collodion formulas, and yeah, sure, each one might be slightly different, but they'll still work. Ferrous sulfate, for example, years ago I was in the garden centre and I saw ferrous sulfate and I thought, oh, and it was it was hygroscopic, so it had moisture in it, and I thought, well, it's ferrous sulfate. So I took some home. I had some analar grade as well. So I shot a plate, I cut it in half, and then I developed one half in the analar grade one and one half in this crappy ferrous sulfate from the garden centre, and you could not tell the difference. So from then on, I would say to people, if you're having trouble finding ferrous sulfate or you don't want to pay money for it, go to either a hardware shop, and that's what people do now. Go to the hardware shop and we buy moss killer.
Yeah, this is the Tui moss killer.
Very good, that's the one. And we go to Mitre 10 or Bunnings, our big outlets, and I just say to people, go there and buy yourself some Tui moss killer, and that is your developer, and it works absolutely fine. And people sort of throw their hands up in horror and say, what, using moss killer for your developer? But it works.
Yeah. It's chemistry, right?
It is, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. And, over here we can't really get potassium cyanide for fix.
Right.
So we just use sodium thiosulfate, and just a clearing bath as well before you put it, once you've developed and then fixed it, then we put it just in a clearing bath just to get rid of some of the thiosulfate, and then just give it a really, really good wash. But I've never ever had any problems with that. But the cyanide gives you, that lovely coffee and cream look. But here you need all sorts of permits, and you've got to do courses on how to handle it. The only thing that people really use it for is killing possums, which are a big problem over here.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So Brian, what would you say is your primary subject in the work that you shoot?
Landscapes. That's always been my thing, because I build cameras for people, but the biggest one I built was 20 by 24 inch for a chap who's called Ben Kalki, who's a real up and coming wet plater. And so I built that years ago for him, but the largest I've got is 10 by 12. That's my landscape camera. And I built a darkroom cart years ago. I used to have just a dark tent which you put your upper body in, and I would use that for years and years. And then I built this darkroom wagon which I can tow along behind the car and just hop in the back of it, and it's my darkroom there, and we use that quite a lot. So my main focus was landscapes. The thing was with me, I would never shoot anything. I like the historical side of it, and so I would. If people would say to me, "Oh, can you take a shot of my car or whatever?" I'd say, "Well, no. The process is from the 1850s. Why would I want to take a photo of a modern car?" Now, my wife and I will. If people want shots like that done, we'll do them. But I was always more for the historical context of it, so that if there was an event like down in Oamaru, down in our South Island, every year they would have a Victorian festival, and everyone would be dressed in Victorian clothes. And I used to take dozens and dozens of shots down there of people all dressed like that. So to me, it was always the historical side of it that I was interested in. And it's also the same with our lighting. We do have some continuous lights, just a couple of big lights and a UV light. If we're doing, say, shooting in at night time or whatever, or an event, it's shooting inside and it's dark, sometimes we'll use those lights. I never use strobe. I'm not a big fan of strobe at all, mainly because I just don't like the idea of blasting people with so many thousand watts of light.
Yeah.
And they come out looking like like a possum in the headlights. But also I find that part of the magic of the process or the experience is for people to actually sit still. I've made up a couple of head braces and we use those sometimes, but I think that's what people expect. They read about the process and about early photography, and they say, oh, people have got to stay still for minutes. Well, usually it's nowhere near that, but I still like to give people the experience of actually holding still while you're doing the exposure, and I do find, and some people will poo-hoo it, but I do find that taking close-up portraits, I call them wetplate passport photos, where the eyes are in focus, the nose is out, and the ears are out, and with strobe, freckles just stand out amazingly. You get some little kids, and they might be a little bit freckly. Well, you hit them with strobe, and it's incredible how.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it does. So that's another reason why we tend to use just natural lighting. And sometimes, when we're teaching the process, it might be raining or whatever, but we always manage to get through and to show people that you can actually use the process in whatever lighting situation, and just to alter your exposure or whatever to do to deal with changing light.
Sure. You mentioned your kind of traveling wet plate wagon that you've got. What was the inspiration behind wanting to have your own wagon?
Mainly because New Zealand, being a little island, it's pretty windy here. So with my portable one, which is suitcase size, and I would just unfold that and put it onto a big tripod. But the danger with that was that the wind could catch it and bowl it over, and there's your silver bath gone. So for years I did use my little suitcase type one. You had to put your whole upper body in it and keep your body in there until your plate was ready. Well, after like a hot day of working in the sun, your results tended to get very, very abstract, with the collodion fumes, with the alcohol and ether especially. So that was another reason why, I thought, no, I've got to build something bigger, which is portable, and I could tow it behind the car. It's all warranted. It's roadworthy certificate and all that sort of thing. But it was also that you were out of the wind and also the cold. Every year I'd go down to Oamaru, and that's right down the bottom of New Zealand, and it was most of the time the weather was pretty cool, and sometimes it was bloody really, really cold. So that was another reason where I could get in out of the cold, out of the weather, out of the rain, and process, do the whole process there. But also, when I was out and about doing landscape photography, it was great to be able to just pull up, go round, open the back door, and everything was in there ready to go, and you didn't have to actually set it up in your little dark tent. So that was the main inspiration to actually build this little cart.
Yeah, that's great. Takes a lot of time sometimes to set up a portable tent type kind of thing and get all your chemistry. And I guess if you've got everything already in one spot in the wagon, it's like you say, it's ready to go. So
Yeah, for sure. You can have your silver bath poured and just clamp down so it doesn't leak. I had that. I learnt that one pretty quick. At one stage, I was driving along and I happened to look behind me. I could see silver nitrate whizzing down the side of the van, so I had to repaint that. But so I learnt that one pretty quick. But yes, it was a lot more convenient. You could just go into it and everything's set up. And away you go, As I still use the little portable darkroom if you're quite a long way away from where you can park your car, and that works fine. But no, the little wagon works even better.
So, Brian, you had mentioned that you have quite the distinction of being the first person to take a wet plate image in the new millennium. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, in 1999, I built my darkroom wagon, and with the millennium coming up, I thought, oh, maybe a baptism of fire for it, so to speak, would be to take it out to the east coast of New Zealand here, where I live, which is about an hour's journey from home. And I thought, well, if I could get there as the dawn was breaking, I'd be the first one to actually take a wet plate, because being on the east coast of New Zealand, the only other piece of landmass is the Chatham Islands, which is part of New Zealand anyway, and that's 800 kilometres to the east of us. And really there's something like 700 people on the Chathams. They're mostly farmers and fishermen, so I knew that there was no one out there that would be taking wet plate, and I knew that I was the only one in New Zealand at the time doing wet plate. So I thought, well, I was pretty safe in the assumption that if I could get some shots, I'd be the first.
Nice. And what was your subject during that session?
Subject is there's a beautiful lighthouse out at Castle Point. There's a great reef and a great rock formation, and on top of that is a lighthouse. So I was able to set up on the beach looking up at the lighthouse, but unfortunately the sun was basically right behind the lighthouse. That's the only angle I could get, so it was a bit of hit and miss trying to get a good shot without flaring the background too much. I ended up with no sky at all in the shot that I did get. I shot about 3 plates, and the best shot was where I just opened up the shutter and just opened up the aperture and got a good shot of the lighthouse, but basically nothing much of the sky. It was just too burnt out, too flared.
Right. Well, I'd say your chances are probably pretty good that of those 700 people that were out on that other island, I would say pretty low probability that any of those were shooting any wet plates at that same time. So it's quite the distinction.
Yeah. No, I know. I've been out to the Chathams, and it's really quite primitive out there. As I say, it's nearly all just cray fishermen and farmers. There's a few farmers out there, but really, I knew of no one who was actually. I was the only one that was making collodion as well, so I would have known if anyone had been wanting to buy collodion, it would have come through me. So I knew pretty well that I had captured the first one. So yeah.
Very nice. That's a great story.
Yeah. It's as I say, and I've still got the plate. That stage I was coating my sheet metal with bitumen, so I took a couple of tin types basically, which they weren't great, but the amber type that I took was better than the couple of tin types that I did. They weren't very successful at all. But yeah, so I've still got a half plate amber type of the of Castle Point Lighthouse.
Very nice. Do you have a preference for glass, aluminum, or ferrotype?
We shoot mainly on glass. I just like amber types because you can flip them over and view them correctly, which is one thing. But also when I'm developing them, the glass, sometimes you'll know that, when you've got, doing a tin type, that sometimes when it gets to its basically it's time to wash the developer off, that it sort of veils over, and sometimes it's a bit hard to tell exactly when to stop development on it. But I do find with the ambrotypes that they're a lot better like that. I cut my own glass, so we can just have whatever size camera we're using. We can use it for that. Aluminum, as you guys call it, or aluminium as we call it. Yes, we use that when we're doing events, because it's nice and quick, and people can see the image straight away. There's something magical about it when you take that plate which has been developed and washed off, you take that back out into the light, and you say to people, especially kids, you say, well, here's your plate, and they look at it and it's a negative, and it's like, and you pour you fix onto it, and then it slowly becomes a positive. And so sometimes, as I say, especially with children, who when they look at it and they think, oh, that's just amazing, that it turns from a negative to a positive. But I used to do my own asphalting or bitumening on metal before the aluminium thing took off, and that was just a messy sort of process. I got some roading bitumen. I would dip the metal plates into it, and then I'd bake it in a little oven that I had out in the garage. But messy sort of stuff. So then it was the Ostermans who actually put me on to aluminium or aluminum, and the engraving stuff, that everyone seems to use nowadays. And they sent me over some samples of some really, really thin stuff, and yes, I think they were the ones who actually introduced that to the wet plate community, and so many people use that now. And it is very convenient, peel the plastic off, do your image, and then straight back,
Exactly.
to be able to do it straight away on the spot like that, and to have that black backing there is really important as well.
Yeah. What kind of backing do you use for your glass images?
For years I started painting them just on the back, which works up to a point. Then I was using nylon velvet, which the pile on it is a little bit thick or a little bit long. It's very hard to find something with very, very thin pile. And also, being nylon, when you put your plate on it, it would bend the fibres, and you would always get a bit of a reflection. So what we use now is stuff, it's what they use in jewellery boxes, and it's called flock. And I don't know if you've ever seen it. Yeah, they have it, and sometimes they use it like for draw liners, and it's like a cardboard or a card backing, and on it is a black, it's very much like velvet, but the pile on it is very, very short, and it is very, very black. So that's what we use to back our ambrotypes, and it's the best stuff I've found yet.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. A lot less messy than the asphaltum that I use and some other folks use for backing.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, Will Dunaway, my friend, he was always just use, he would coat his own ones with asphalt or bitumen or whatever. But it's very, very messy and time consuming. Yeah, it's traditional, and that's what gets me a lot of the time with people say, oh, sometimes we use black acrylic as well instead of black glass. As you know, that black glass is expensive and it's very hard to find. Black acrylic is a lot cheaper. It's we get it cut from the acrylic place. They'll cut it down to whatever size you want, and again, that's got a peelable coating on it, and that is about the best black that I've seen yet, apart from black glass. And really, you can't tell the difference. Once you have mounted it up, there's hardly any difference between what you see on black glass and what you see on black acrylic. Some people, and I've had feedback, people say, oh, it's plastic, and you think, well, okay, but, are you using aluminium? That's not really traditional either,
Yeah.
But no, black acrylic is, sure, it is plastic, but boy, it gives you really, really nice results.
Yeah. Yeah, I would guess that it's probably a lot smoother. It's probably similar to aluminum plates. I mean, even black glass that I get, you can still see a little bit of texture or almost wave to it a little bit. Whereas that acrylic, I'm sure is probably pretty flat.
Oh, it is. It's
Yeah.
absolutely perfectly flat,
Yeah.
and it certainly makes a difference. And one of the guys that I taught the process to, I showed him one of these plates, and he said, "Oh, can I try it?" So he shot a shot on that, and now he's absolutely hooked on it. He just won't use anything else. He said it's just absolutely amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. I've got a story I can share here real quick. What one of the examples that I give a lot of times whenever I'm in schools and things and talking about the process and I'm telling about the material and the aluminum plates that I use, and I usually say, hey, back in the 1860s or 1870s, they would have never considered using aluminum for this process. And just to give you an idea why, is the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C., at the very top of it, it's got kind of a pyramid shape, and they wanted to cap it with something. And they wanted to put the most precious material that they had at the time at the very top. And what they made the cap out of was a piece of aluminum. And at the time, I think it was like the largest naturally occurring piece of aluminum that anybody had ever found, because they hadn't discovered the smelting process to actually extract aluminum from ore. And so it was very
Right.
difficult to find big quantities of aluminum where it's such a common metal for us today. So
Yeah, for sure.
yeah.
We've got a huge aluminium smelter down on the South Island, and yeah, no, as you say, and it's reasonably priced as well. So
Yeah.
just looking at a couple of my notes here, one thing I was going to mention, that when we're running workshops for people, we always say to them, it's the technique. Some people will come along and they'll bring all sorts of outfits along for the workshop, and just so they can get shots of themselves. They'll shoot the plate or whatever, and then they'll stand there. We'll take the lens cap off, and then they'll get the shot of themselves. So a lot of people do that, and I'm saying to them, really, it's the technique that you're learning. It's your pouring of your collodion, it's the pouring of your developer. Those, two things that you've really got to get down pat to get really, really good plates. When the first workshop that I ran years ago, one chap, he was a 2-day one, so he was staying at a local motel. And on the first day, his pouring ability was terrible. He absolutely just could not pour a plate. You'd say, hold it, horizontal, or level, and he would never get it right. And the next day, he turned up and he poured a perfect plate, first one. And I said, wow, that's a bit of an improvement from yesterday. And he said he went back to the motel that evening, and there was a glass chopping board which they'd use for chopping up onions or whatever. So just a perfectly flat glass chopping board. And there was a container of dishwashing liquid. And so he sat there for hours that night pouring dishwashing liquid onto this glass plate and then pouring it back into the bottle. Then he'd wash it off, pour another one. And
Nice.
you can imagine the motel owners wondering why all their dishwashing liquid had gone. But he perfected it. So on the second day of the course, he had it down to pat.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I always thought kind of a slightly watered down maple syrup is probably a pretty good substitute for trying to learn how to pour collodion. So
Yes, that's for sure.
yeah. So Brian, we touched on this at the beginning about you're a bit of a collector. How many cameras have you got in your collection?
Probably 350 maybe. At one stage, what I've done is I've got a shipping container, 40-foot shipping container, and I've lined that out with polystyrene and ply, and it's all basically air conditioned. Well, it's not air conditioned, it's got dehumidifier and so forth in it. So when I moved my camera collection out of boxes and so forth into there, people used to say to me, how many cameras have you got? And I'd say, oh, probably a couple of hundred. Well, I got to 300 and I was still going, and I've bought more since. But most of my cameras are wooden brass. I like early cameras. My wife, she collects later ones like 35mm and those sort of things, but I've got all sorts. I mean, I've got 35mm underwater cameras. I've done a lot of diving in my years, and so I've got underwater cameras. I've got stereo cameras, 35mm stereo cameras. So really, people sort of say, oh, you know, some people would just like Leica collectors. That's all they'll collect. With me, I'm a bit of a magpie. Anything to do with photography, film photography, and early photography especially, I'll collect. You know, it's like my ambrotypes and daguerreotypes and tintypes. Recently, we had a visit from a team from the New Zealand National Library here in Wellington, and their eyes were hanging out of their sockets when they saw how many cased images I had. They said undoubtedly the best collection in the country of hard images, you know. But camera-wise, yes, I've got dozens, literally dozens of wooden field cameras. I've got wetplate cameras. I've got all sorts. So, and a lot of those we tend not so much the really early ones. I don't like getting silver nitrate stains on my wet plate cameras, on my originals, but a lot of the later ones we still use, and we still use the film cameras a lot. Whenever my wife and I go away on holiday or whatever, the first thing we say is not what we're taking, not where we're going. It's like, what camera are you going to take? So, and usually it's several of different formats, you know. So, yeah, a lot of cameras, and unlike some people who just put them on a shelf and not use them, we try and use them as much as possible. And the quirkier the camera, the better. You know, and some of the reactions you get from people when you turn up with one of these cameras, you know, it's some of the older people will recognise them, but a lot of the newbies will say, well, you know, what sort of memory stick does the, you know, does that 35mm camera take? Or they look at the back of it. That's one thing. You know, we'll take a photo with a film camera, and then they'll say, oh, I want to have a look at it. You know, and they grab the camera and look at the back of the camera, and they're not going to see anything.
What's your go-to lens?
Go-to lens? I have got so many. I do like my Taylor Hobson British lenses. I've got a lot of their brass ones. I like Voigt lenses as well. So my wife, she's, as I say, more into 35mm and 120. So I probably couldn't tell you what her favourite one would be. But yeah, I do like the early brass lenses.
Yeah, I picked up C.C. Harrison here not too long ago, and I think it dated from the serial number to about 1863, I think. So that's probably my oldest lens that I've got.
Oh, right. Yeah, Harrison, we don't get them in New Zealand very often. I know Will Dunaway, my friend, he had a whole heap of them, but no, we get mainly British lenses here, and it's like our ambrotypes and daguerreotypes. Most of what is in my collection would be British, you know, brought over by immigrants when they come to New Zealand. But no, I've got some very, very large brass lenses, and we do try and use those as well. I think my oldest is a French one, Labois and Secretan, I think it's called, and it would be from the 1850s. Yes, it's got a lot of bokeh. You know, your centre of focus is really quite small until you put your Waterhouse stops in it, and you obviously get more. I make the Waterhouse stops out of any of my old aluminium plates, the duds. I just cut them out of that. So yeah, but
nice.
So that would be the oldest lens that I use.
Okay. So have you had anybody that you would consider to be sort of a celebrity or a famous person in front of the camera?
Yeah, I suppose. When I worked for Peter Jackson, I sort of missed my opportunity. I could have got him to sit for a portrait, and I still might. I know Peter quite well, so I still would like to actually get some of our New Zealand celebrities in motion pictures to actually sit for the camera. Taika Waititi, I don't know if you know him, but he's another one. He's he's done quite a few big movies recently.
Okay.
So, but yeah, the odd rugby stars, because New Zealanders are right into their rugby. But yeah, so not too many really well-known people, but yeah,
Well,
as I say,
I've heard that maybe you had the chance to be on the other side of the camera in a documentary. What was that process like for you?
yeah, that was cool. It wasn't wetplate. It originally someone had said there's a gold miner down in the South Island, and he was a miner, but he was also a photographer, and called Josh Divis, and he took amazing shots of the town of Waiuta, which is now a ghost town, but it was a gold mining town in its time. Um, and so they were making a film about Josh, and someone had said, "Oh, Brian knows all about wetplate." Well, when they got hold of me, I said, "When was he operating?" And they said, "Oh, right up till 1930." Yeah, it was only
Yeah.
in that very, like, maybe for a decade.
Yeah.
And I said, "No, you're barking up the wrong tree here, because I'm more into wetplate." So
Yeah.
they passed me on to the director and producer, and they said, "Oh, well, you could, if you're, you know about that sort of photography as well, on glass plates, dry plates. Do you want to be in the movie?" So yes, I got a part in there. I was wandering around Waiuta, what was left of it, explaining how he would have shot on glass plates. So yeah, so that's a little movie that I think it's on Netflix now. I think you can get it, or Sky. One of the things have picked it up anyway.
Okay.
And
Nice.
then, yeah, so that's going to, it did the rounds of the smaller cinemas, but yeah, that was a bit of a hoot. But it wasn't wetplate.
Yeah. Brian, collodion seems to have become a very popular medium over the last decade. It's almost turning into a mainstream process. Why do you think it's finally caught on to a larger audience?
I've been asked this before. What I think it is that people, the way technology's gone, I used to be able to go out and pull the engine out of my car and fix it and whatever, and now with the computers and everything in it, I wouldn't touch it. And I think people are the same. They look at their with their device. They've got a telephone, which is actually more of a camera now than a phone, and no one, or very, very few people in the public, would know how that thing works. They wouldn't pull the back of it off and try and fix it. So I think that there's this kickback on technology. People are just losing track of how things work. And so I think that was why wetplate has made such a resurgence over the last 10 years or so, that people just want to actually make something themselves. And I think the idea of sitting down, or getting themselves all the chemistry together, making an image, and that they have actually made, that it's not just their phone that they've picked it up and clicked off a half a dozen shots. I think there's that kickback against technology. It's also a little bit like with vinyl records. We had, with DVD or CDs and so forth. That has sort of dropped off. A lot of people are going back to vinyl because it's back to grassroots, and I think that's really what wetplate's all about. That people actually want to make it themselves. They don't want some machine to actually do the photography. They get a real kick out of making it themselves.
Yeah. For yourself, what is so special about this process that's made you stick with it for so long?
The uniqueness, I think, of it. That you've created something which is just a one-off. It's not a print. I mean, we've done alternative printing, like salt prints and albumen and so forth, but so they are a print or a gelatin print. But with wetplate, what you're producing is a one-off, and I still get a real buzz or a real kick out of when you can produce a really nice plate. So sometimes you'll get a mediocre type one and you think, yep, as you sometimes you'll just have a bad day. For some reason the chemistry just does not want to play ball.
It's
But
it's it's kind of
I
fickle
think
sometimes.
it is very fickle. You'll know that, shooting wet plate yourselves, that it can be very, very fickle. But when you get it, producing results which are almost perfect, that's a real buzz. And I think that's, to me, because I'm interested in the history of it as well. Some people are not really interested in the history of the process. They just want to learn the process just so they can go and do it. But to me, it's the historical side of it. It all ties into what I collect and to what I do. I also do muzzle loading shooting as well. So, people say, why do you do it's so difficult, and why would you do wet plate when you can just shoot it on your phone? Because it's a sense of achievement, the sense of, that you've actually produced something. It's like that when I'm shooting as well. Why don't you just pick up, something and just put a cartridge up it and bang it? You say, no, that's a hell of a lot better and a lot more fun to actually get out some black powder and some musket balls and do the whole thing. So it is, to me, it's never lost its appeal to me because you're producing something from scratch and producing something which, most of the time you can get a pretty good image. What I don't agree with, but some people really like all the oyster marks and so forth, and you can say, well, okay, get a cotton wool ball and just gently rub it over it or wipe it over, and you can generally get rid of most of your oysters. Some people will go for it. They say, oh no, the more the merrier, and they'll just leave them on there. And I'm saying to them, well, when you look at the early photographers and their work, very seldom do you see any imperfections in their plates.
Right.
These guys, they were so expert in what they were doing that very, very seldom do you see anything. You hardly ever see an oyster mark. I collect early photographs, mainly New Zealand as well, albumin in particular, but Burton Brothers are probably our famous photographers over here, and when you look at their prints, they are just amazing. These guys work down in Fiordland, down the bottom of the South Island, where the mosquitoes, are huge, and sandflies. And when you look at the plates, you think, how the hell did these guys keep the mosquitoes and the sandflies off the collodion when it was wet? But some people just tend to really, really like the imperfections. I'm not really of that school. I like to get the plates when I get them as clean as possible.
Yeah. Maybe that's a kind of a byproduct of today, where people are used to having these filters and things that they can apply on all their digital images. This is somewhat of a aging filter on collodion. They have those oyster marks and other issues.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Which, it even with all that technology, they still don't look the same, do they?
Right.
You get a wet plate image and you get something which has had filters applied to it. It's just not quite the same.
Yeah. Brian, you yourself are a mentor to many of the students that you've had in your workshops. Who are some of the people that helped you along in the early days, maybe learning the process, or that have become a mentor over the years?
Well, and as I mentioned before, the first guy to give me, quite a lot of help, and that was only like a brief meeting at one of our little camera club meetings. He came over from Australia. His name was Sandy Barry, and he had done the process in Australia for a few years before that. So he sort of put me right as far as, definitely what chemistry you needed. Oh yeah, don't use flexible collodion. Make sure your alcohol is not denatured, it's not mixed with methanol and whatever. Get pure alcohol. So he was instrumental in helping me with the actual chemistry side of things. The Ostermans, Mark in France, they were great as well. They sort of put me on right track as well, as far as being able to shoot. Well, I think, as I said before, they were I think instrumental in getting the trophy aluminium thing going, but also Will Dunaway, very much so. I had quite a lot to do with him. He used to call me sort of once a month, and we'd have a good old chat about what we were doing and so forth. I visited him several times, and so yeah, he was probably my main mentor. Very, very generous chap with his knowledge, with his equipment. He gave me all sorts of stuff. He would shoot plates every time I'd go there. He would shoot a tin type of me as well. So I treasure those. Yeah. So those three people or four people were probably the most instrumental in helping. As I say, in New Zealand there was just no one.
Yeah.
That was just seat of the pants.
Yeah, that's a great collection of folks to get you started and go to for help, for sure. Yeah. Hey, Brian,
Sure.
as we wrap things up here, what's the best way for people to either see your work or maybe to have their portrait taken by you?
We do have, I did have a website at one stage, but that sort of dropped off. At some stage, I've actually got to, now I'm basically retired, probably got more time to actually set up one. My wife and I do have a site or a page on Facebook, and it's called Brass and Glass Photographic Alchemy. And people can go on there and see basically what we do. If we've got lots of photographs of the events that we attend. One of them's a Boer War event, and even though that's from the late 1800s, early 1900s, that silly little war was fought, we've got a group of reenactors here who get us to come out every year and do shots of them. There's also the cowboy action shooting guys. They're really big as far as getting or wanting to get stuff done. So there's a lot of photographs and stuff on that page if people want to go and have a look there. If people want portraits done, well, if they're in New Zealand, by all means, they can come and see us. Our details are actually on that page. So that's probably the best way to contact us. Also, if there's any wetplaters who are travelling down this way, I can supply them with all the chemistry they need, that sort of thing. They could bring their own camera, but otherwise, I can supply all that sort of stuff to them.
It sounds like you've got plenty of cameras to rent out, too.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Hey, thanks,
Yep.
Brian. I appreciate you being on the show.
Yeah, no,
So-
I appreciate being able to be on the show. Thanks for that.
Great conversation. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much.
I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode and maybe even picked up some insights that will help you along in your own wet play journey. I'd love to hear from you on who you'd like to have on in a future episode. So send me a message and follow our Instagram account at 10 questions with any feedback. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast provider. Thanks for listening to me, Chad Shryock, and my expert guests, and I look forward to you joining me again in the coming weeks for a new episode of 10 Questions.